Hi, I'm Alicia. This is Unencumbered. Today I'll be discussing Michael Todd's relationship goals. So I'll start off with the positives about this book. The first one would be that he is married, so I have a picture of him and his wife in the background, and he has a more authoritative view on marriage than myself, someone who is not married. You can tell that he's intentional about dating for his church, community, and our generation. I think that's really evident in his book. Like, you can tell that he truly does care about how our generation is treating love, how our generation is dealing with relationships. So you can tell that his heart is there. And he also talks about in one of the chapters how he has this intentional friendship program where he kind of counsels couples. And I think that's really awesome, not just a pastor that says like, oh, these are good things you should have in a relationship, or these are the good things that you should do, but actually does the work. So I'll start there with my positives for this book, because I think that's how you always should start a critique, is that, start with the positives. So the first chapter is called Taking Aim, and he basically kind of goes through how our culture has really put up this idea of relationship goals. And, you go on Instagram, you see these couples, and it's like hashtag relationship goals. You go on YouTube, there are a bunch of like family channels. And so you see these and you're like, oh, this is what I want. These are my relationship goals. And then it kind of goes into how we kind of have unrealistic expectations of what relationship goals are. On page 15, he writes, "Many of us don't have our aim directed when it comes to relationships. We take whatever comes. We do whatever's comfortable, but we don't really know where we're going or why." And so that's kind of like the main vision of his book, is that he wants to help his readers understand where you should direct your relationship, what you should be thinking about as you go through the progression of a relationship. And so he talks about how you go from single to dating to engaged to marriage to love, and like how that, progression is important. Chapter 2 is essentially about needing a relationship with God before you pursue a relationship with a significant other. And so he talks about how in Genesis you have God creates Adam and God are, in relationship with each other, and then God creates Eve as a partner for Adam. And so he also talks about how Adam has this mission, his mission is to tend the garden. His mission is put before him before he has a partner. And so he kind of begins that to kind of say you need to have a relationship with God, and God is going to give you a purpose before you have your partner. And so when you walk into that purpose and you're kind of setting up different things for your life, then you can come into having a relationship with someone. On page 32, so this is when he's talking about, how, you have a relationship with God, and then because of that relationship, more people are entering into your life, and then you have to kind of decide, is this relationship from God, or if it's not a relationship for God. And so for him, he says, you can usually tell whether a relationship is from God just by looking at this one qualification. Does this relationship help me? Think through all your close relationships and ask yourself that question about each one. We tend to tolerate so many relationships that are taking away from us, stealing our peace, ravaging our joy, and keeping us up worrying at night. Why? When I read that, I was getting a very, chop, cut people out of your life. And sometimes you do need to do that. Like, definitely that's something you need to do. But there are relationships, you have chosen relationships and then relationships that you're put into. So when I'm thinking about chosen relationships, I'm thinking about your significant other, your friendships. And then you think about relationships that you're kind of placed into, such as, a sibling relationship, or a relationship with a parent, or cousins, etc. Family relationships, a relationship with your boss, which is kind of like, it's kind of chosen, but also, not necessarily. So it was just something I thought about, and thinking about the fact that it's hard to say that all relationships will be giving to you, because there are some relationships where it feels like it is just taking. And so it's like, oh, how do I decide when it's taking, when it's not taking? So basically this chapter ends just kind of saying that Adam was working on his purpose and focus on his relationship with God, and then Eve comes into his life to kind of help him with his purpose. And Michael Todd doesn't really go into this, but I just want to make a little caveat here, a little addendum. That's not probably the right word, but whatever. To say that sometimes when we look at that Genesis story, Genesis 1 and 2, in one of the creation stories, we have God creates Adam and then says, it's not good for man to be alone, and says, okay, well, we need to bring Eve into the situation. And so then we, in our heads, we kind of think of Eve as a secondary character, as someone that's just supporting what Adam's mission was. But then you also have another creation story in Genesis where humanity, so not, the language isn't Adam and Eve, but humanity is made at the same time. And so those are just, I just want to mention those are two creation stories that we do have in our biblical text. And I'm not putting this on Michael Todd, that he was saying that, Eve comes there to support, a woman or her man, and like, guy, he's single, and then, he's working on himself, and then a woman comes in and just supports him. Like, I'm not saying that's what Michael Todd is saying. And then number 3, chapter 3 is called The S Word, and it's about singleness, and just builds on this idea of, when you're single, you have a relationship with God, and you have to be really intentional about building yourself up during this time. And he talked about how he wished he had more time being single and like really working on himself and getting to know himself, because that would have helped him in relationships, and specifically his relationship with his wife. And so for me, like, I know I've been single for a long time, and I feel like I've done a lot of, self-inventory, and yeah, I do agree that singleness is a time to do that, but I also think you need to do that throughout relationship. And I believe he does mention that, like, throughout your relationships, you do need to spend that intentional time working on yourself as well as working with your unit, your partner. And then he also talks about how marriage isn't something that you just jump into lightly. And so it shouldn't be a thing where it's like, okay, well, I'm getting tired of being single. I'm getting tired of, I'm not having a +1. I'm getting tired of wanting marriage and not having it. So as soon as someone is interested, I'm going to jump on that opportunity. And I do think that's hard to read, especially thinking about our current dating climate. If we're honest, there are a lot of, well, I don't know how I want to say this, because I will say I do believe I have a bias, and I'm going to be perfectly honest with this bias. I do think there are a lot of great women out there who deserve and are like A+ people that should be in relationships, that are not in relationships, and that desire relationships. And so I get a little, like, I don't say annoyed, but there's a part in the book where he's talking about, like, this woman is saying, like, oh, I've been single for so long. And he's like, well, you're talented, you're beautiful, you have all these things going, and I know you're going to find someone. And that's just not the truth for everyone. Like, there are fabulous people. And I'm specifically talking about women because of my experience and people that I've talked to, or women that I've talked to. And I'm like, there's so many fabulous women that deserve relationships. And, so I do want to, like, just put that out there, that it's not always you're doing something wrong. There's a huge problem in our dating climate right now. And I'll kind of go into that later, but that's just something I want to mention for this chapter. Like, when we're talking about singleness and desiring, that desire doesn't always come true for everyone. And it's not a matter of, read this book, follow the formula, because I think we have a lot of that in this culture. People come out with relationship books every day, and people read them and digest them. And sometimes they do have really good information in them, but we have to be honest about experience. Like, I can follow all these rules and still end up single. Chapter 4 is about intentional dating, and he talks about basically him and his wife met when they were really young teenagers. I want to say like 14, 15, and they were dating for a while, and they got in his head about, like, well, maybe, this is the only girl I've ever dated. Maybe I need to get out there and experience other things, which he described that experience as a bad thing. He actually said he felt like that was the devil and culture in his ears, saying that he needed to experience more. But I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. But that's his experience. If he felt like him dating, like, breaking up a relationship, the way he did it was pretty bad. But in terms of, when you're in a relationship and you're young, to be like, okay, I think we need to split, kind of explore a little bit, and then come back together if that's what we're both feeling. So I think that's, like, situational. So in his situation, he thought that was bad for him and his wife. And so he talks about how him and his wife kind of got to this point where they were dating other people. They started having sex with other people. At this point, they're not together. They were kids. He talks about intentional dating and how that wasn't intentional dating. And he defines intentional dating as being purposeful. It's fun too, though it preserves purity. Most importantly, it's driven by a clear goal: to determine whether the person you are dating is right for you to marry. It's all about moving toward the covenant of marriage with the right person in the right way and the right time. So I thought that was, I honestly don't think that's new information. I think anyone who's grown up in the church, you're constantly hearing, you know, you should be dating with the intention to get married. That's like a very common thing you talk about in the church. But I think often in the church, sometimes we do this whole intentional dating and it becomes so extreme, you know, where you get to the point where you can't even go out on a date with someone without thinking like, okay, well, when are we gonna get married? When should I start this timeline in my head of when I should expect a proposal and like all this stuff? And it's like, relax, you're just eating burgers, like calm down, you're just having a milkshake. Well, I guess for me, it was more like meeting someone and getting to know them is fun. Like, I think people are interesting, and like spending an afternoon or evening talking to someone and getting to know their life story and just discussing with them was fun. And then, you know, my back of my head, you know, of course, to an extent, you're thinking, you're like, okay, well, I'm interested in this person. I can imagine things becoming something more, but it's not like while you're on that date, you're thinking, okay, well, he's the one, and like all this stuff. So no, I feel like there has to be some type of balance, which I'm not saying he doesn't say there's a balance, but I think we do need to kind of put in our head that there needs to be such a balance. And I will say with dating culture now, you know, as someone who has done the online dating thing, it's not date focused. It's not date focused at all. It's either hookup. We know hookups is like very, very common. So it's like hookup culture. Then it's like, I'm looking for a relationship. Then it's like, I'm looking for a companion where you're going to do all the things that you would do in a relationship, but I'm not going to claim you situationship. So I feel like there are a lot of those going on. Chapter 5 is called Does It Need to End? And in this chapter, he's talking about when you're in that period of dating, when there's a time when you feel like this isn't working for me, I don't think I'm doing enough for this person, I don't think the person's doing enough for me, we're just not working together. He is very clear that this is not a chapter that he wants married people to read and say, okay, now I know I need to get a divorce. He'd rather them look at that chapter and say, now I know I need to go to counseling and work on different things in my marriage and not lead to it ending, which is something I was definitely critical of with Todd, because the first time I ever even heard this man's name was a friend of mine. She sent me one of his like relationship goals videos, and I'll link it in the bio if I can find the specific one she sent me. And he was talking about how married women cannot leave their marriage even if they're getting abused. The only way to leave it is if someone cheats, something like that. And you know, he was pulling that from the Gospels. And because, you know, something that Jesus had said in the Gospels about, you know, you can't divorce unless someone commits adultery. And so he was using that, and he was saying, well, I don't know what to say. Like, that's what I've read. And so I guess you're going to stay in, you know, that abusive relationship. And I thought the like tone was like super weird, and I didn't like it. And I'm not going to lie, that made it difficult to read this book, because in the back of my mind, I was like, I have this pet peeve here when we, you know, read something in the Bible and we don't take into consideration the communities and how our words can affect different communities, because people should come first. And so I was a little critical about that. So in this chapter, he doesn't mention anything about it. I think when he doesn't mention abusive relationships, he talks about a boyfriend-girlfriend situation. So I don't love that. I feel like he should have said something about it. So then he talks about Abraham and Hagar. And so just a quick summary of the story in Genesis. Abraham and Sarah are very old, but God gave them the promise that they were going to have a child. So Sarah is like, okay, well, I'm old and I'm not seeing that happening, but you know, God gave us this promise. Abraham, you probably could have a child, probably not with me, but Hagar, my servant here, if you sleep with her, you could have a child, and that will be, we'll just, say that's our child. Then that happens. They have a child named Ishmael, and then Sarah gets pregnant, and she's like, whoa, didn't expect that, God. And so, God's promise that they were going to have a child comes true. Sarah has the baby. So then that creates a tension between Sarah and Hagar. Well, I'll say that story is very complicated in terms of how Hagar is treated, how Sarah is the person that comes up with the plan, and how, a woman coming up with a plan is like against God's plan. So there's a lot of elements to that story that I hopefully will be able to discuss in another video, but I don't want to make this video any longer by doing a little tangent discussing that. So that'll be a future video. But Michael Todd uses this passage to say that Abraham breaks that relationship with Hagar very quickly. And so I was a little uncomfortable with that, because it's difficult to say. So Hagar was a servant in this situation, right? So Sarah said, "Here is my servant for you." So it wasn't like Hagar had decided, "Oh, Abraham, let's, have a relationship, and, let's, make a conscious decision to be together." Like, that's not what happened. So for him to use that story and say, "Okay, well, this is how you should be modeling your breakups," was a little uncomfortable for me, especially thinking about how Hagar is represented in the text, and we'll get to her at some point. Yes, I would definitely have another video about her and Sarah, and like how they're represented in the text. Chapter 6 is called Surrender Your Sexuality. This is kind of the part of me reading the book where I was like kind of eye rolling a little bit. And part of that was because like at the beginning of this chapter, he equates orgies, masturbation, incest, and child molestation, all in this group of like sexual sins. He doesn't talk about same-sex relationships, which I was surprised about. With him equating all those things, I think he doesn't really get into a conversation about consent. And I just want to put that out there, that consent is important, and in those various, like, for example, masturbation and incest are very different things, but we won't go into that in this video. I will say that we do need to be more honest about what is in our biblical text. We have this book in our text called Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, depending on which Bible you read. And this is discussing very passionate sex between two people that are not married, or at least the text doesn't say that they're married. And then also throughout the Old Testament, it speaks about bride prices and the fact that a woman's virginity had a monetary value. And so that's what made it, good to be pure. And this wasn't something that you discussed about. This wasn't something that concerned men. It wasn't like, okay, well, men and women both are pure on their wedding night. No, it was about, you want your daughters to be pure virgins, so they're worth more when, the suitor pays his wife, when the suitor pays his bride price, she's worth more if she's a virgin. And there's a lot of language around that and purity. And so I will say, as a woman, there's more of a aversion when it comes to purity language, because there's a lot, because that's often pushed a lot on women. And so I just wanted to point that out. Another part that I had an issue with in this chapter is when he's talking about how men and women aren't their bodies, which I think, yes, we are not our bodies. We are whole people. So, we have our bodies, we have desires. We got to be real about sexual desire. We have that. Most, people have that and experience that. And yes, we're not our bodies. And so we kind of affirms that, like, yes, you're not your body. Your body's not the only thing that has worth. And I was like, okay, I get that. You want people to not be so sex obsessed, where it's to the point where you're like, my body and what my body can do is the only thing that's worth anything. Okay, got it, check. So then he's talking about this metaphor that the guy heard at a church. And it says, okay, he compares a person who's had a lot of sexual relationships to a box of chicken nuggets that has been passed around in a group of people that touch them, nibble them, and spit them out and still aren't satisfied. And then from that, he got the lesson that nobody wants to be chicken nuggets that are left in a box after they've been handled by a bunch of others. They weren't created to be picked over. They were meant to be enjoyed. And so I don't like any type of metaphors that use sex and consumption together, because I don't think that's a good way to describe sex. And I was in youth group, I remember hearing those things. You hear the backwash one, if I take a sip of soda, and you might want to drink it after Johnny takes a sip, but if Johnny and Melanie and Tasha and all these people take a sip, you're probably not gonna want it. Like, that's not a good, like, sex isn't about consumption. That's not, that really, really bothered me reading that. And I think because it just brought up a lot of memories about purity culture and how negative it is. Okay, then we get to the lovely chapter called All Tied Up, and it was about soul ties. And if you know anything about me, I do not like the language of soul ties. Soul ties is used as a way to make people afraid of having sex. That is usually how the term soul ties is used. And typically the verse that it comes from is when it talks about David and Jonathan in the Old Testament and how they have a very close relationship. Their souls are tied. But then, we're not talking about, so that's like a positive version of soul ties. But when we talk about soul ties in the church, it uses this languages, but then it's like, okay, but this is negative and it has to do with when you have sex. So whenever you have sex with someone, that creates a soul tie. And I don't believe that's true. I don't think that's accurate at all. I think sex is a very complicated thing, and depending on the relationship, how things happen, it's not something you can say there will always be a soul tie if you have sex. Like, that's not something you can say. I love what Candace Marie Benbow said when she was interviewed or having a conversation with Kev on stage. I will put the video of her speaking about soul ties in the description of this video. I think she's a great speaker, and she talks about how soul ties that's not the thing. When she talks about soul ties in terms of romantic relationships aren't a thing. She thinks the only soul tie is between a parent and child. But specifically talking about relationship soul ties, she says that people get so caught up on that language, and she gives an example of how her mother was speaking to a young woman. This young woman's like, well, I feel like I've had this soul tie with this guy. Like, whenever I hear songs that we've listened to together, when I think about him, I cry and all this stuff. And her mom was like, you didn't have a soul tie, you were in love. And you're heartbroken. Like, you're heartbroken. That's why you're feeling this way. And so I think that's a better way to describe it. And then the last chapters are just kind of about marriage and like how to make marriage work, really practical things. The last two chapters, so I didn't have many notes on them. He talks, so back to the timeline where he's going from singleness to dating to engagement to marriage to love. And so he talks about how you have feelings to the person and you love them, but it's not until you actually marry them and you kind of have that sacrifice that you actually have that experience of love. So that's why he puts love after marriage. So I thought was like, okay, like, you're trying to do something different. I see you. So he does mention that. And in the last chapter, he talks very practically about like, what do you need from a partner, and what do women need? What do men need? And I'm always hesitant about that language of like, men need this, women need this, because I like to think of people by who they are, how they grew up. So, me as a woman, I'm going to need different things in a relationship than someone else who's a woman will need in a relationship, because of how we grew up, things that we value, and that kind of thing. So I think it should be more of you get to know someone and you find out what they need in a relationship, and you ask them what they need in a relationship. Overall, I would say this book is okay. I didn't think it was revolutionary or information that I haven't heard before, but I will say that you can tell that Michael Todd does care about relationships. I do think there are things that he does make missteps on when it comes to purity language, and just like how our current culture is. I will say that he does make some missteps there, but overall, I get that he really wants to help couples. If this was something that you've already read and you found that it was really helpful to you, I'm happy that it's helpful to you. I think the main things to learn that you can kind of get from this book is that you have to be intentional about relationships and realize that your singleness is a time for your own growth. In the comments, let me know if you've read Michael Todd's Relationship Goals. If you have any opinions about it, I'd love to start a conversation there. And yeah, so as always, you are loved, you are affirmed. Stay unencumbered.